And so the next one, after our own Vietnam for the United States, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. And in the process, we start supporting the Afghan defenders. One group they called the Mujahideen. And among them was a Saudi leader named Osama bin Laden. Through guerrilla warfare, this becomes what's called the Soviet Vietnam, and it helped quicken the USSR's collapse as it became a drain on Soviet resources. The next proxy conflict was in Nicaragua in 1981 to 1987. In this one, there's a government that was elected peacefully in 1981, and it was a leftist group that had some Marxist ideals, but they weren't necessarily straight up communists. They got their independence or came to power after the fall of the Somoza family dictatorship in 1981. The United States then started backing groups to try to overthrow this group called the Sandistas, and they were called the Contras, or against. This is one of those times where I say we got to look back at our past. The United States has to look back and realize some of the things they did were not that good, or supported people that weren't that good. The United States was involved in lots of coups to overthrow governments that we worried about becoming communist. And in the world where any one time our bombs could fly against us, we worried more about making sure these countries were in control by anti-communist groups, even if they weren't democratic, even if they were military dictatorships. So our funding of the Contras, Reagan, or possibly Reagan, but we know within the Reagan administration, Congress passed a law that said you can no longer fund you can no longer support any Contras groups against the Sandistas. And we already had an imposed embargo of Iran for military weapons. What our National Security Council did under Colonel Oliver North was sell weapons to the Iranians, use the money to then fund the Contra groups. And what I mean what we did, here's what Contras were accused of: targeting healthcare clinics and healthcare workers for assassination, kidnapping civilians, torturing civilians, executing civilians, including children who were captured in combat, indiscriminately attacking civilians in civilian houses, seizing civilian property and burning civilian houses in captured towns. So the Human Rights released a report on the situation in 1989, and they stated that the Contras were major and systematic violators of the most basic standards of the laws of armed conflict, including by launching indiscriminate attacks on civilians, selectively murdering non-combatants, and mistreating prisoners. In his affidavit to the World Court, former Contra testified that the CIA did not discourage such tactics, and to the contrary, the CIA severely criticized me when I admitted to the press that the group they were fighting with had regularly kidnapped and executed agrarian reform workers and civilians. We were told that the only way to defeat the Sandistas was to kill, kidnap, rob, and torture. One Contra leader did deny that his forces targeted civilians. What they call a cooperative is also a true concentration full of armed people. We are not killing civilians. We are fighting armed people and returning fire when fire is directed at us. So I post all of this, and I write to this so that we get understanding of just what these conflicts entailed and what the United States was involved in. Because a lot of the history of my future and your future is going to be directly relevant to what the United States did during the Cold War. So when we wonder why does most of the world dislike us or do not like our government, these are some of the reasons. This is what happened to people's fathers and grandfathers and grandparents and mothers. I mean, like, this is the severity. So someone was negatively affected. Most of Latin America was affected by our imperialism and involvement during the Cold War. So we do need to put that understanding that they don't hate America because of our freedom or how wealthy we are or how well off we are. They see that we got this way through exploiting other nations as well as dominating them with military dictatorships. And so that's just to put into context the whole situation in that. So, how did communism spread? Well, China is the first good example of the spread of communism here. And I realize going over China right now, we actually have never gone over what happened in Russia. In World War I, the Russians were suffering. They were losing bad losses. The war was unpopular at home. And their rapid push towards industrialization left a few haves and a lot of have-nots. And the Tsar continually ignored the people starving, the riots, assassination of family members, thinking that his people love him because he's God's appointed leader on earth. By 1917, it was getting bleak. Parts of the army were mutinying or refusing to fight. There were riots in most cities, and a socialist government takes over. In March, I think. I forget, but it's 1917 and early in the year. They vow to stay within the war and try to administer government from a democratically elected or like a republic. Though it doesn't work out well, and it's failing. And so in October of 1917, or November in our dates, Vladimir Lenin comes in and overthrows that government, called the Bolshevik Revolution. He then reorganizes the government. They capture several cities, and have a major civil war. And in the very early parts of the civil war, they execute the Tsar and his family. Those of you who know about this story, Anastasia was executed as well. She was found, I think, 200 or 300 yards away from the rest of the family. So it wasn't she got away or there's a long-lost daughter out there somewhere. Following a 4 or 5 year civil war, I think it ends in 1922, where the Soviet Union is formed and in full control over all of its territory. Lenin dies, I believe, in 1926, and Stalin takes over and really changes up how things were going. Stalin gets a little bit conservative in social attitudes, like women should not be in factories, women should be at home. He becomes a lot more authoritarian than was designed by the original communism, and really institutes what we think of the Soviet Union as the Soviet Union. Collectivization, which you've seen as being disastrous, refusal of farmers to give up their animals, so they'll kill them instead of giving them up to a collective, leads to one of the worst famines in history until the next one under the Chinese. That's the roundup of the Soviet Union. Communist China has a civil war starting in the early 1930s, and nationalist forces pretty much are able to repel or defend against the communists, and so Mao goes on what's called, Mao Zedong, leader of the Chinese group, that goes on what's called a long march, where they march towards the interior of China with his supporters to find a new camp away from the cities and the heavy populated areas of the nationalists, to regroup, reorganize, and fight back again. During that time, the Japanese also invade in 1932, and then 1937, there's a full-scale war against China from Japan. The Chinese two sides vow to fight the Japanese and not fight themselves. And so they begin just not necessarily cooperating, but at least fighting the Japanese. Though, Mao being in the interior, most of the damage done by the Japanese is onto the coastlines and major cities to the nationalist forces. After the World War II, the Civil War resumes, and by 1949, Mao and the Communist Chinese are victorious. First, they start being friendly towards the Soviets, but by 1960, that completely breaks down Soviet and Chinese relations. Mao institutes what's called a Great Leap Forward to help industrialize China, where he pushes for people to try to make their own steel in their backyards, which is a complete failure. Led to a lot of collectivization and still continued farm exports even while people were starving. You should have read about all of this already in Edible History of Humanity. And in this great famine, roughly 15 to 55 million people are killed, the greatest famine in history from all of this, all these policies. Next is then the Cultural Revolution, where it was a socio-political purge of anyone that was viewed to be counter-revolutionary or not part of communist beliefs. Basically, it was to purge the remnants of capitalist and traditional elements, keep Mao Zedong as the dominant and his Maoism as a China-first communism. And the thing is about communism is it's global. The idea is to get all the workers of the world to unite and overthrow the powers that be. So communism as an ideology doesn't stop in one country, it spreads. It's supposed to, because if you are liberating yourselves from the chains of the bourgeoisie, you want to do that to your neighbor so that they don't have to deal with that anymore. And so the idea of communism is to spread it. Mao's view was, let's work on China first before we can spread it and look at China as its center. And that's what changes what's called, Maoism is his own version of communism. What happens, though, is it's less able to recover from failures and bad decision-making, which further hurts China. Now, other policies that come from the spread of communism, a lot of places try to redistribute land or take over by the state over land that is owned by companies and corporations. Some in areas that, in India, there's the Kerala province that elected democratically a communist party to help with land reform and redistribution. In Guatemala, there was policies to take over fallow or unused portions of United Fruit Company's land, which is Chiquita Banana. Because of that policy or that proposal, the United States supported a coup in 1954 to overthrow the government, and it was successful. In Iran, in 1953, a democratically elected prime minister attempts to nationalize Iran's oil production from British oil interests, and Mossadegh is his name, is overthrown in a coup in 1953 and institutes power by the Shah, who will rule until 1979 when he's overthrown. The Shah, when he came to power, tried to institute some land reforms as well to secure his support, to secure his base from his own people. And he also was known for having his own private death squads and secret police. It was a time of oppression for the Iranians, and that's why they resort to a religious overthrow of the Shah with a theocracy that institutes the Islamic Republic of Iran in 1979. Communist revolution in Vietnam as well, for more worker benefits and the people and commoners. And Mengistu, Haile Mariam in Ethiopia, wanted to have cooperatives and state farms, also having a red terror of purge of anti-revolutionaries. And so we see a lot of times when communisms come to power that it's not just a simple and peaceful tactic, it's also a get rid of all dissenters. Che Guevara, who when they took over Cuba and got in control of government, they were executing people they thought were part of the regime that did some atrocities, and was suggested, why don't we have a trial? And he said trials are for the victors, for a government and a country, not for revolution. So, yeah. So the next part to the spread of communism to this is decolonization. How these places are no longer under the imperialism of European powers. So Decolonization after 1900. So this is going to be one of the first times we're going to talk a lot about people. Individuals that helped structure their governments and countries and move them in a direction that's influential and noteworthy for this class. So first one, the idea of decolonization was that nationalist leaders in Asian Africa sought autonomy. And first was the Indian National Congress, which pushed for an independent India even in the 1920s. And while it didn't have so much success then, it did by the 1940s and post-World War II, where they were able to negotiate with the British their independence. Ho Chi Minh was a communist leader of Vietnam that pushed for autonomy for Vietnam, and then when the French were trying to reimpose their empire, the Vietnamese fought them for about 9 years. Kwame Nkrumah here looked for a Pan-African unity and was pushing for not only independence of Ghana, but also to look at the African countries need to work together. And then that's Gamal Abdul Nasser, and wanted a Pan-Arab League, and stressed unity of Arabs. And goes through land reforms, pushed for some secularization of Egyptian society, and he nationalized the Suez Canal in the 1950s, which caused a major crisis where the French and British forces were supporting the Israelis to try to stop it, and it gets to a really big mess. And but yeah, that's a different story for a different time. Independence through negotiation. So the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League negotiated with the UK for independence, and that led to the partitions of India into Pakistan and eventually East Pakistan, which then becomes Bangladesh later after a war with India. The Gold Coast gains its independence from the United Kingdom and becomes Ghana, and most of French West Africa gets their independence, with the exception of those that tried to get their independence or did get their independence through conflict. Particularly Algeria in 1962 fought an insurgency against the French that led to the French pulling out. Angola got its independence in 1975 after armed conflict against the Portuguese. And Vietnam I already mentioned as well. So there were other ethnic, religious, and regional movements that challenged colonial rule. The Muslim League in India did not want one large Indian state. They wanted a Muslim country as well, for Muslim Indians, in a sense, the idea of people in the Indian subcontinent before there was an India country. The Quebecois in Canada have now had several referenda on whether or not they want to become independent from Canada. And so far, each time it has failed, but it is getting close. Since there's a large population of French speakers in Canada, in Quebec particularly. And then the Biafra movement in Nigeria. Here's Nigeria, and this region right here has about 2 years of independence, maybe 3, where they revolted, created their own state, and failed. It was finally taken over and destroyed, basically, over time. But that was their own version of trying to get their independence through conflict, and that was regional, not necessarily just getting their independence from their mother country, but having their own independence. So there are other countries that are created completely out of borders and realignments, and so some colonial authorities withdraw and create new states as they do. This led to a creation of new boundaries, which also caused displacement, conflict, and resettlement. So for here, one of the examples is Israel. It was completely created out of the British Mandate of Palestine, granting a certain amount of land to the Palestinians, Arabs, and a homeland for the Jews. At its inception, it was invaded by 6 countries all around it, and Israel had to fight off all 6 countries in the matter of, I think it was 3 months of warfare before a peace treaty or ceasefire was enacted. But throughout Israel's history, they've had about 5 or 6 major wars for its existence. And so those border conflicts, these drawings of boundaries and borders, have created these conflicts. Cambodia, which the Khmer Rouge, which is roughly translated like Rouge French is red, and Khmer is like the Kingdom of Khmer, Cambodia. So that's their political group. They're the ones that started under Pol Pot and had the killing fields and genocides. After the Vietnam War, there's a bit of a falling out between Cambodia and Vietnam invades Cambodia completely and actually takes the capital, with Cambodia, surrendering and collapsing its government and changing that up. But once again, borders are defined that create conflict. And then Pakistan, the partition here created, if you notice, inter-community conflict between the two, and then movements of people in and out of those 2 regions. And a lot of these people would have to leave their homes, within days, and sell their homes for very dirt cheap because, hey, you're leaving, right? You don't... If you're a Muslim and you're going to Pakistan and you need to get out, you need something for your house if you're going to have any money. So people that were staying would gouge you for that, same as the Pakistanis did to Hindus leaving. And so it created a lot of tension, particularly at the borders. Now, strong governments in the new states got involved in the economy. Nasser worked very hard to develop Egypt, its industry, the Aswan High Dam, all these kinds of projects to bring Egypt in closer to the more advanced technology and the I don't want to say first world, I hate that term, but the more developed countries. India has Indira Gandhi here, who centralized a lot of India's government and played a role in trying to develop its economy, trying to find that what's called that, like I said, third way, a way in between getting help from the Soviets as well as getting help from the Americans without angering either one. And this woman, I haven't found a way to pronounce her name. It is Sirimavo Bandaranaike. She is the first prime minister, female prime minister in the world in 1916. She had a lot of economic policies in Sri Lanka, nationalizing sections of the economy as well as being the first elected leader of a country. Now, there is global resistance to established power structures. So those that were without power, let me get Idi Amin in the way, we'll move to him in a second. So the first, though, many groups opposed the trend towards conflict, while others intensified conflict. And some of those nonviolent proponents, Mohandas Gandhi here, advocated nonviolent resistance against the British, including sit-ins and boycotts. That proved quite effective and made the British very much look bad about their policies to actually eventually bring India into a shutdown, where the British bringing the British to a negotiating table to get independence. Martin Luther King Jr. advocated nonviolence as well, in civil rights leader in the United States. Nonviolent resistance as a method to bring about and show how awful these situations are. Particularly the segregation laws and then just treatment of African Americans in the 60s. Nelson Mandela pushed for ending apartheid through nonviolence. And apartheid was a very racist society and legal and political system in South Africa, where whites had power and voting rights and blacks did not, in a population that only had about 10% that were white and 90% black.
But I thought this was the best example or definition of apartheid I'd heard. You say it was a police state, a system of surveillance and laws designed to keep black people under total control. A full compendium of those laws would run more than 3,000 pages and weigh approximately 10 pounds. But the general thrust of it should be easy enough for any American to understand. In America, you had the forced removal of the native onto reservations, coupled with slavery, followed by segregation. Now imagine all three of those things happening to the same group of people at the same time. That was apartheid.
That was apartheid.
That's a beautiful explanation.
Yeah,
Beautiful
that's really what it was. It was perfect and studied racism, you know, it's disappointing sometimes when you realize how far some people will go, what lengths people will go to oppress other people. I always think to myself, with all of that talent, you know, I think of my high school teacher who'd be like, if you just applied yourself, young man, you could do so many good things for the world.
Yeah.
I think of how many amazing things they could have done with South Africa with that same, because apartheid was an evil genius plan. It's amazing in its, you know, in its insidious nature, and that's really what it was all about.
And so you were literally born a crime.
Right, right.
Born, yeah.
Right, everyone was separated. And so black and white and even smaller groups within race, you know, so in America oftentimes it's just black and white when the discussion is had, but in South Africa they were meticulous. So it's black and white. Within black was divided into all different tribes, and those tribes were separated from one another. And then even within different races, like Asian people separates Japanese, a different class to Chinese, and Indian, a different class to other types of Asian. And this was a system designed to make sure that every group was small and oppressed in a different way.
That's right. And speaking different languages so nobody could communicate.
Right.
Yes. Yeah.
It's funny, in South Africa we have a saying, and you must remember, because of so many of the struggle leaders in South Africa were either imprisoned or exiled, the movement in South Africa was held together in large part by women in the country. And so it's weird for me, because I understand you travel the world, you understand that everywhere feminism is different and the idea of women is different. But I grew up in a world that was very matriarchal and where women were the most dangerous freedom fighters that existed. No, this is true. You read up on Winnie Mandela. Like, Nelson Mandela was an icon, but the police in the country were afraid of Winnie Mandela. You know, they were, and we had a phrase in South Africa that was, we still use it today, which was, "Watinta bafazi, watinta mbokoko," which means you strike a woman, you strike a rock. And that's what I grew up learning. It was kudos, man. It was fire. It was fire. And a lot of the time, my mom would strike me with a rock. And
So. Now, militaries often responded to proliferation of conflict in ways that expanded and intensified conflict, meaning, as these problems occurred, as there's resistance, that resistance to the order had military response. And because of that, oh, come on, man. Because of that response, it turns into making things worse. So, left-wing leader, Salvador Allende is his last name, was elected and proposing some reforms and changes to Chile's government and economy, and it met with some resistance to the established order or worry about communism, to lead to Augusto Pinochet having a military coup. And Spain, this is Francisco Franco, had an anti-communist civil war in Spain, or in a very conservative, not royalist though, because he wasn't trying to put the king-queen back on power. Became dictator of Spain in the 1940s, or 1939, and the Spanish Civil War was one of the first was a precursor to World War II, in that both sides tried out a lot of their technology and weaponry. The Nazis, supporting Francisco Franco, sent him a lot of goods, German-made tanks, machine guns, planes, whereas the Soviets sent their support to the other side. And it was a proxy war of sorts before they even started, to see what these things and the tactics and weaponry could do. Francisco Franco ruled Spain until his death in 1975. Idi Amin, one of the worst dictators in history in terms of his reign of terror, torturing methods, murderous methods, indiscriminate killing. He would put people on meat hooks through their shoulder, at both shoulders here, and then torture victims or whoever he disagreed with. He would boast and insult world leaders. He pushed for more military actions in the countries around him. And instead of him being a way to stop the government that he overthrew in a coup, he made things worse in the region and made it even less stable. And finally, just overall, the United States concept of and everywhere else is the military-industrial complex, that we are producing more and more guns and weapons, and we're profiting from it. So if warfare becomes profitable, that becomes a business. So you need war to continue your business. And that's one of the major concerns President Eisenhower had before he left office.
Address of the President.
A burden of arms, draining the wealth and labor of all peoples. A wasting of strength that defies the American system or the Soviet system or any system to achieve true abundance and happiness for the peoples of this earth. Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children. The cost of one modern heavy bomber is this: a modern brick school in more than 30 cities. It is 2 electric power plants, each serving a town of 60,000 population. It is 2 fine, fully equipped hospitals. It is some 50 miles of concrete pavement. We pay for a single fighter plane with 500,000 bushels of wheat. We pay for a single destroyer with new homes that could have housed more than 8,000 people. This is, I repeat, the best way of life to be found on the road the world has been taking. This is not a way of life at all, in any true sense. Under the cloud of threatening war, it is humanity hanging from a cross of iron.
Next up, too, other resistance include violence against civilians to achieve political aims. And what we mean by that is terrorism. So here las masas hacen la historia, el partido las dirige, which just means the masses make history, the party directs them. That's the shining path of Peru, a left-wing group that used all forms of terrorism to try to bring about a leftist takeover of Peru. They used assassinations, bombings, beheadings, and massacres, as well as stoning victims to death or placing them in boiling water. The IRA and the Troubles, you had in Northern Ireland a difference between the Catholics and Protestants, where the Protestants wanted to stay part of the UK and the Catholics did not. The IRA resorted to all forms of violence, including kidnappings and bombings. They bombed 10 Downing Street and almost killed the Prime Minister by about 10 feet. And 10 Downing Street is the British White House, basically, the residence of the Prime Minister. You had terrorists that were anti-Israel, whether it be Hamas or Hezbollah or the Palestinian Liberation Organization, that eventually becomes the PLA, the Palestinian Liberation Army, or association that becomes the party behind Palestine today. And then you have Al-Qaeda, where it uses explosives and suicide bombings against the United States, mainly for the United States' presence in the Middle East post the Gulf War. And they were the ones that were behind the September 11th attacks in 2001. And so finally that brings us to the end of the Cold War. Now, some of the major reasons are technological development. Being a free market meant that people who wanted to engage in development of technology had incentive, financial incentive, to do better. You had the Soviets losing out resources in its costly war in Afghanistan. Gorbachev tries to loosen some rules and trying to allow more openness in society, as well as some reform and changes in governance. And then you had the discontent in all the Eastern Bloc countries as well. One story, the Berlin Wall falling, as you see here, wasn't planned. In fact, it wasn't supposed to be a thing. But what happened was private travel. So what happened in 1989, there was an announcement by the government that the private travel outside the country can now be applied for without pre-requestees for East Germans. And surprised journalists clamored for more details, shuffling through notes. The speaker said that as far as he was aware, it was effective immediately, that anyone could go into Berlin, West Berlin, without having a reason. They could just apply for it. And gave out details about applying for a visa. But the news went all over television, and East Germans were starting to flock towards the border and border walls in large numbers. And a border guard in charge that evening told a newspaper his story was that he had watched the press conference in confusion and watched the crowd arrive. Not knowing what to do, he called his superiors, who had no orders whether to open the gate or to open fire on the crowd. And with only a handful of guards facing a bunch of angry citizens, he could do little against the force of the crowd. There's way too many. So he said people could have been injured or even killed without shots being fired in scuffles, or if there had been a panic among thousands gathered at the border crossing. So it could have been a mess. So he gave the people the order, open the barrier. And once they did, it brought down the wall. And within days, the entire government collapsed and Germany got reunited. And then finally, the Soviet Union collapses in December of 1991. So that's the end of Key Concept 8. So hopefully this was a little more informative. The notes will be on here as well. Have a good one, all. And I hope you all got a sense of that anxiety through all of the atomic bomb videos and stuff. Like, the point was to be a little antsy about all that, because that's why the United States did what they did. That's also why the Soviets did what they did. All of them were paranoid about being obliterated. So anyway, thanks for watching. Have a good one. Later.
This is Commander Gilmore, U.S. Strategic Command, and General Borshevsky, Russian intelligence.
Russian intelligence? Are you mad?
A lot's happened since you were frozen. The Cold War's over.
Well, finally those capitalist pigs will pay for their crimes, eh? Hey, comrades? Hey?
Austin, we won.
Oh, groovy, smashing. Yay, capitalism.
These are the stakes. To make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other, or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.